weird in its own right, but more importantly, it's anti-American at its core and rankles me in ways that I think we ought to discuss in greater depth than just knee-jerk reactions. So a lot to talk about, but instead of the usual conversation we were about to have, Matt, I'll bring on my guest, Matt Taibbi, who I had a chance to meet recently at the Republican convention. We struck up conversation, and this is an outgrowth and a follow-up to that. But Matt, welcome to my podcast, and I'm excited to chat with you about some subjects that might have been a little bit different than what we were planning on.
No, thanks for having me on, and good to see you again, Mr. Ramaswamy. That was a pleasure to meet you last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago now.
A couple weeks ago, yeah. Time flies. So what do you make of this? You know, obviously we don't have all of the facts yet, but the appearance that we didn't really get necessarily the full truth of what the FBI knew, or even what their full beliefs were. What do you make of that? And in particular, from your vantage point as a longer time journalist studying government transparency, goes at the heart of a political journalist, how does this fit into a broader history of what we know about how the government really does or doesn't tell the truth to us about issues of public importance?
Well, I think it says a lot about a lot of things, actually. The FBI has transformed itself into a different kind of organization, really since the beginning of the War on Terror years. After the hearings in the 70s about the reform of the intelligence community, the FBI essentially became almost entirely a law enforcement agency. It could not conduct investigations without some kind of predicate. They had to demonstrate that. That changed really in the Bush years. There was a series of directives that allowed them to essentially conduct investigations without any real important cause. And the agency has really become much more of a counterintelligence, intelligence gathering agency, as opposed to a law enforcement body that just investigates crimes and tries to gather evidence. So when they give
basically a general purpose investigative agency as opposed to responsive to a particular alleged violation of the law. That's what you're saying, which is absolutely, I think, spot on. But that's what you're saying.
Yes, and the problem for us as journalists is that the FBI, I mean, I've dealt with them a few times over the years, the FBI, DOJ. Once upon a time, if they could, they would give you information, but it would always be, here's what we found out, here's what evidence we can disclose. They were not being political very often in the way that they would disseminate information. That wasn't really part of their mission. That wasn't the way they wanted to be perceived either. Mm-hmm. Now, in the wake of the Trump assassination, there's this crazy symbiosis between a press that doesn't really do any work and the FBI, which issues these completely nonsensical, off-the-record statements. Well, they'll tell people, like, we've done 100 interviews, but we have absolutely no information about what the possible motive is, which is completely impossible. Anybody who's done 100 interviews with people who've known the suspect will have some kind of idea.
They have a theory, at least. Yeah,
they'll have a theory. And now this new thing where they affirmatively tell the public they're trying to convince us that crooks had anti-immigrant views. When that contradicts the actual evidence, that tells you that this is a politicized body. And, that's a very scary thing for people because it has ramifications beyond just the news.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that the deeper issue that, animates sort of my own pursuits, whatever they are going forward, is the people we elect to run the government are absolutely not the ones running the government today, which creates a complete loss of accountability that rejects the project of the American Revolution. But as it relates to the FBI in particular, I actually agree with almost all of your telling of it. The only part where I depart from this as a student of the history of this institution is actually the idea that it began this pivot in the aftermath of 9/11 and the Bush-Cheney new neoconservative national security state. I think you're right about the shift from being an investigator of a specific alleged crime or an enforcer or an enforcement body to being a general purpose investigative unit. I think that that's largely accurate as I understand it as well. There's a longer history, though, that the lawless nature of the culture of the institution, one that views the law as a constraint rather than a motivator. Let me just put it that way, right? It's one thing if you're a law enforcement body, maybe you view the law as your motivation. Your motivation as an organization, your organizational raison d'etre, reason for existence, is to enforce the law. That might be what most Americans think is the purpose of federal law enforcement. But it's a different thing if you have a federal law enforcement body that views the law as a constraint, an inconvenience on its behavior, but its reason for existence is something else altogether. That I don't think is just uniquely true post the Bush years, though it's true certainly after the Bush years. That dates back to J. Edgar Hoover and an FBI that largely has existed the way that you and I know it probably is probably the closer to the better part of a century.